Offline. Yeah, I'm singing like offline because it's kind of I always do offline recordings because I tend to do several. The last couple takes, I was kind of so I'm going to light a cigarette to make that even worse. So it is Sunday, May 6th. Happy Hangover Day for those who celebrate Cinco de Mayo, which, just like St. Patrick's Day, is seeming to be more and more people. But it's fun. Hey, I used to live in Corona in New York City, which was a heavily Latino area, and that, oh my God, lots of fun on Cinco de Mayo. Here I go again. Maybe that cigarette wasn't the greatest idea. But I'm also having a bulletproof decaf coffee. I already had my caffeine several hours ago. So I just kind of use decaf with the grass-fed butter and the coconut oil. And that is my bulletproof decaf. And I think that's kind of causing this. So forgive me if I clear my throat a few times. I know it's annoying. But I'll try to kind of keep it to a minimum. Anyway, so I'm doing these walks this morning, and that's my segue into the actual, what I want to talk about. And towards the end, I'm kind of getting excited because I'm kind of getting an idea. I have an idea. This kind of mix of observation and idea, something that kind of fits your observations can also often kind of feel like a eureka moment. I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but I have this loose kind of theory that may be just kind of obvious, and I don't know that everyone already knows this. But I was thinking about monotheism and this kind of turning of man into this kind of like bloodthirsty savage, right? So much war has happened in the last few thousand years compared to prior to that, evidently. We have evidence that the ancient Egyptians were actually trading with the Hittites, all sorts of things that end in ites, like all these civilizations, and there was this kind of like worldwide, at least for the Mediterranean, they considered that the world, and everything else was, here be dragons. So they had this kind of worldwide, and, like I said, in their view, kind of trade network, and they may have actually gone to the Americas too. They would send expeditions all over the world and trade with people. And you get, what's funny is you have an area, the Pacific coast of South America, and then you have another area that's like the east coast of, I believe, India, and there's evidence that they had some sort of trading partnership, or at least they had sent expeditions back and forth. And then you see like these kind of, odd hieroglyphs, and odd carvings in like areas in South America that were distinctly like Eastern. So it seems like the world was at least not so apt to destroy itself. So what happened, and this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and it seemed to be kind of tied to, or at least, I always had the kind of impetus that it was tied to monotheism. So I was thinking about the three big Abrahamic religions and the kind of proto-monotheism that one of the Egyptian pharaohs kind of pushed out. And when he died, all the other kind of temples were like, fuck this shit, let's go back to our old religion. I think there might have been kind of people who kind of kept the new religion of kind of monotheism, like a pseudo-monotheism, where it wasn't, this is the only God, but this is kind of the greatest God. This is a God above all others. And that's pretty much early Judaism. And they had according to one author that I've read kind of a few books that kind of hint at this, or hint at the history that creates the observations I want to make. There was a kind of a home to this cult, not in Cairo or Alexandria or that area, but further east And these were kind of like these lower Egyptian nobility. And we don't know if they were like Hyksos or if they were the actual Jewish peoples, etc., etc. But let's say that these kind of lower Egyptians, according to this author, had some sort of say in government and perhaps were this tribe of Abraham, and they had kind of tried to become Pharaoh, right? If you think about the Pope, which in many ways the Pharaoh was, he was like the head of the church, as far, so it was a little bit different from a king. You would have people kind of vying for control with the populace of that. Like, no, I'm really the Pharaoh. No, I'm really the Pharaoh, right? So you might have these different sects in Egypt. So it'd be kind of inevitable when you have this kind of Pope-like figure that you're going to have split-offs. And much in the Bible doesn't really contradict or support this. It's just kind of, they don't talk too much about it. And they talk in vagaries very often. So things could be interpreted in several different ways. And of course, there's also the kind of idea that it's propaganda, right? So maybe there was this group, maybe before they were kicked out, they were enslaved for a couple hundred years, which is fucked up, right? But maybe that's where that slavery came from, and that's why we don't have any evidence of slavery in certain other places like the Giza Plateau, where you have the Great Pyramid and the pyramids in general, and the two other not-so-great pyramids. What's so wrong with them? They're just a little smaller. Anyway, these poor other two pyramids. They should call the Great Pyramid the Greater Pyramid or the Prime Pyramid or something. Well, I got to put down the other ones. So you may have had this kind of sect that stuck with monotheism or brought it in. Who knows, right? There are several possibilities, and there are, like I said, all sorts of biblical interpretations, but it does seem to ring true in much of what I've read that early Judaism wasn't really our God is the only God, but our God is better than your God. So at the time they were leaving Egypt, it seems that it wasn't as developed into monotheism as we kind of consider Judaism today. So they would go and they would have this huge advantage in that our God is greater than your God. And if you see in the book of Judges, they would have this military advantage because they'd have zealots. And that's a huge religious zealotry, like somebody just run into the enemy soldiers for God, right? Almost like the Scottish berserkers. I don't know if they were Scottish, north of the main British island. I think they might have been Picts, but they were Scottish, Pictish. There was some people up there, and then of course there was the Highland Charge, and there was these berserkers who wouldn't use shields. They would have 2 axes, and they were completely fucking insane because they were drugged out of their minds into that kind of bravery you get with beer bowls, but much, much more like a hallucinogenic beer bowl. Set of beer bowls. I'm sorry, I didn't want to make anyone uni bowlers. So this kind of zealotry we've seen throughout history, it's a huge advantage militarily when you could throw people there, at your enemy who are just kind of fucking berserk and high on God. And there's even, I've seen studies that talk about kind of the religious high. Not as powerful as the hallucinogens the berserkers were using, but it's still, when you have, let's say you have a bunch of militia, you have your kind of militia-like army, and they kind of line up, into kind of like a loose kind of mob, and they're sitting there opposite their enemies. They're going to, that you're just going to kind of have people clash, but you're going to have more like the leadership caste will kind of be in the front, lead from the front, or you're never going to get those guys to move at all, right? And a lot of people are cowards, so a lot of them would kind of try to, be at the back, kind of like when you walk into class in high school. You're like, oh shit, I didn't do my homework, let me go into the back, because you're scared of something, right? So these people would be kind of scared of getting, being disemboweled and killed. So you'd have kind of a lot of, in these non-religious armies, these armies without the greater God kind of concept permeating through them, you'd have a military disadvantage because a lot of people would be cowards. They wouldn't, they're harder to get riled up. They don't have the same kind of impetus, this religious impetus to kind of attack the infidel, right? And so all you need is this kind of concept of they're infidels, like their God is, just a bullshit, God. Our God's a real God, or it's a bigger, better God, or it's a creator God. Ooh. So maybe they had kind of the concept of it's the creator God. Your gods are just, minor deities of your area. Our God is the God of the world, and we're going to come in and punish you for being infidels. Wow, it kind of seems like a common theme going forward from that. Even there were attempts in the Roman Empire to kind of deify the emperor. So it'd be kind of a emperor-god cult, and many people kind of suspect that's where Christianity actually took root. It replaced whatever emperor was in charge at that time with this kind of, cult-like figure of Jesus. So now what do we have? Now we might have had this kind of religion of peace or whatever. I don't really know the really, really early history. It seems like the Christians were kind of prosecuted, but they gained lots of converts secretly, probably because they were kind of, a religion maybe really of peace. Who knows? But the spread of Christianity really started with the Romans making it the official religion of state. And of course, the prior religion of state was the kind of imperial, emperor is God religion. And so it kind of like all the kind of churches that were made to emperor whoever, I forget his name. There was an actual emperor that you could kind of point to. They got converted into this new Catholic Church. Now and they even say it when they talk about the history of Constantine, that, he put a bunch of crosses on his shields, and some of his soldiers were already Christians, and they had become kind of a sect within the military and pushing, this belief in God. And now we have this kind of more codified, at least at this point, we've gone to this more codified kind of belief that, it's the only God, right? Throw out the minor gods or the kind of co-gods or the non-creator gods. That kind of gets not only thrown out, but seen as impious, and now you're an infidel. So it kind of reminds me, there was this movie made in Australia, a zombie movie kind of thing. And at one point, there's a priest in a cemetery, and he pops out, and there's these like zombie-like creatures floating around, and he kind of like, I kick ass for the Lord, and he like pops out and starts doing like, Matrix-level kung fu and like kicking the heads of these zombies off. It's pretty funny, but that's kind of the advantage of this kind of monotheistic. Our God is the great God. Your God is, bullshit, doesn't exist, or it's a demon or a genie. You're an infidel. You worship Satan, right? In some sects, you could kind of join in and say, "Oh no, that God is one of our saints." So they had a kind of this kind of mixing of pagan religions and. In some areas they'd kind of go, "Oh no, your deity is really just a saint. We'll give you a saint or something." And that's why you have these different areas with like these different churches of different saints. And then you'd have kind of, oh God, they worship like, Molech or something. And, okay, let's make that Satan, the big bad guy. Make up some stories with that shit. And let's, kill them as, being Satanist or whatever. They're evil. Kill them. Now, you gotta see, like, a lot of times, I remember there was a report in World War II that one of the hardest things they had is that people would kind of panic. One of the biggest problems they had with the soldiers is that you would only get a certain percentage of them firing back. The other ones would kind of cower, right? And you'd kind of have to kind of inspire them to kind of risk their life. And a lot of them were like, hey, you could draft me. You can't make me, jump at a bullet, right? But we have this kind of religion of state, freedom, liberty. That's kind of our religion of state, which I would kind of, maybe it's my upbringing, but I always kind of thought of that as a positive, standing up for ideals as opposed to a deity. Especially if it's like, the deity that promises us the planet. Pretty dangerous. So we have kind of coming from this kind of ancient Egyptian, pseudo-monotheism. We go into this kind of era of monotheism, and I'm sure that there are other religions that kind of popped up and got conquered that utilized it, but just, for whatever reason, they didn't make it. So you have these kind of competing monotheists. And we're kind of going through that today. Now, we have Zionism, which says, that's the homeland of our, not just our people, but our religion. And, of course, unfortunately, it's also a very holy spot for Islam and for Christianity. So there's still these kind of three competing monotheistic religions. Now, I don't want to put down religion in general. I think what happened is, and I see evidence of this in the book of Judges, is that once they kind of went into this religious zealotry, they found that it was such a powerful military tool that they kind of sought to codify it. They sought to institutionalize it, and that's the kind of growth of these kind of conquering religions. Now, Judaism only conquered a relatively small area, but it was a huge advantage, especially to the nomadic peoples that were kind of these nomadic tribes at the time. Wasn't the greatest area to grow things at the time, so it was, you really had to have a lot of livestock. So you kind of had this kind of nomadic, let's go eat the grass over there, or the shrubs or whatever was there. So really it was kind of like you had to have these livestock in order to be, in order to stay fed. So you had these kind of people bred by the area to be a bit nomadic. And then you'd have, certain city-states like Jericho, etc. But as you kind of conquered these areas and you became more of a, you're building temples, which are kind of outposts, right? So you're building these kind of military outposts with temples. And you're kind of building your own kind of little cities and towns. And then you're spreading throughout and conquering other peoples. And it's kind of, a lot easier to conquer, like, nomadic brigands. They're kind of the bad guys, no matter what. You're always going to see yourself as the good guy because they're, other than maybe Jericho and Tyre or wherever else they conquered that had walls, which was the kind of common design at the time. You had these nomadic peoples that were kind of going around and stealing shit. So you kind of had these kind of land pirates, and you could just kind of take the land from them and no one cared, right? Because it was, well, we hate those assholes too, the other civilized people. Unfortunately, then you get enough power and you take Jericho and they're like, oh shit, maybe we shouldn't have ignored these people. So, you have this kind of conquering through zealotry that goes into even the kind of Eastern Empire of Christianity. the Eastern Roman Empire stayed afloat for an extra 1,000 years, I think it was. So we have this pretty good model of how to do shit. How to utilize religion for like this military advantage and for population control. Eventually, someone's going to figure out that if you control the church, you control the people if they're all of that church and they want to be of that church, right? If they actually believe these things and they're into it, the tenets of it, then you have this kind of you kind of have to, right? And you kind of have to change with the religion a little bit as the people kind of, see it a little differently maybe. And then you get this kind of conflict between, now you have kind of a governing body and a separate religious class. And you have to kind of, work that out. And eventually, of course, people are going to mix the two and create these theocracies, which we see today in the Muslim world. Except now you have kind of caliphates. The whole concept of using religion to conquer the world, not as much like Alexander the Great, who was, more just like military strength. We have a better culture. We're more civilized. Although it kind of implies that when you have the religion that worships the one true God, you're going to kind of imply, we're the real people. We're the chosen people. We're the better people. We're the more civilized people because we have rules to life. And they're the best rules we can kind of think of without science. So they get pretty weird, like, don't eat pork and stuff like that, because people would get sick, and much sicker than if they ate bad beef. So you have kind of these kind of convenient rules that kind of develop out of this, and this kind of one true God concept. Now, what was Council of Nicaea? It was like 438. You have a couple 1,000 years of Jewish history, but it's hard to tell on what stage they were at when. They really may have only been monotheistic when they returned to Jerusalem from Babylonian exile. Before that, they might have been more of a polytheistic, but our God is better. Our God's more powerful kind of thing. And that's kind of hinted at throughout, religious texts, especially of other peoples, Very strange mix. And it seems like they were competing, and there were other religions, like I said, that kind of popped up. What comes to mind to me is Zoroastrianism, but I'm sure there was more than that. So they would go and they'd conquer these kind of pagan peoples, and they wouldn't have these religious armies, even though they could have been pretty brutal and awesome at fighting, like the berserkers and stuff like that. And they didn't have this kind of unifying, even if you're further away, kind of religious unity. You're an outpost of the church, but there's a temple there, You're kind of a military outpost, but you got that temple, and that means something. Now people kind of show up on whatever holy day and kind of, either give alms, sacrifice something, whatever the tradition is. It's going to be like a method of unification to these disparate cultures and lands. And, of course, then that kind of overrules the kind of whatever pagan things. And then, of course, those pagan things kind of get rolled in, like Easter, having lots of bunnies and eggs. These pagan things kind of get rolled in traditionally, or, your deity is now a saint. Those kind of things are a way to kind of mix the two. And you kind of grow and grow. And so you have this successful model. And evidently Judaism, Christianity, and now Islam are these kind of successful models of religious zealotry. But now instead of kind of the the armies of Muhammad and the armies of Islam, you have terrorist zealots trying to kind of do the same thing, trying to conquer. And that's, hey, that's Christianity's job, you know? So, there's going to automatically be a conflict. I know I'm going to probably end up like Salman Rushdie on some kind of a, kill the infidel list. But that whole infidel thing is part of the tricks of the trade, the smoke and mirrors of it. We're the only ones who are in touch with the real God, and everyone else is an infidel. And look at like what they do, and you could always kind of pick out a people, and especially the lower socioeconomic status people, and go look at the shit they're doing, look at the sin, look at the impiety. We got to take care of this. We got to conquer them for their own good. We got to bring them our better God, our only true God, to them in order to give them civility. So you have this kind of overarching kind of way to inspire people. And that's where we're at. That's a big part of why we're so warlike. Because we have these competing monotheistic religions, and it can be argued that communism is part of that, in that it's a religion of non-religion in many areas that still practice communism, that are kind of, although they're kind of leading towards a mixed model at these points. So, but there's still kind of like this kind of ideology, and they need their zealots, right? And you see that with kind of the zealots of the left. It's kind of this communistic agenda trying to conquer the world, and it failed pretty much. But there are still instances of it, and it's still kind of a boogie-boo, kind of enemy, even if it's kind of used more as a propaganda tool. I'm sure there are people that are pretty into it. When I see like the anti-free speech people at Berkeley or someplace else where Milo is speaking, I think, oh, look, zealotry is still there. You just kind of moved on to kind of this agenda, ideological zealotry. And that's the advantage. And that's a huge advantage. And things are going to crop up and get shit hammered. And then they're going to get, other things are going to crop up. As we kind of learn through a kind of social evolution of, what works. And the people who want to kind of take over the world, there'll always be that kind of class of people, figure out how to kind of manipulate everything. And religion has been I agree with the kind of, hardcore atheist that religion is also a means of control of the populace. So you get something that works out not only to control the populace, but to inspire the military, inspire military action, inspire conquering, make you the good guy while you're conquering. And I'm sure that people in some Islamic states, it seems more the Middle East than the other areas that are Islam, I'm sure that they have had their share of these kind of competing warfares between different sects of Islam. Even today, we still have Sunni and Shia, and they want to, wipe each other off the face of the earth. But they also want to kind of conquer the rest of the world, and that's something that we need to keep in mind, that any kind of monotheistic zealotry is always going to result in this kind of, we have to take over the world for their own good. Bring them civility, right? And it seems that the stricter the religion, a la Sharia law, the more you can kind of tout that. Look how different they are. There's a thing in many Middle Eastern cultures, I don't know if it may be just kind of a cultural difference that makes them feel like, they're spreading civility. I don't know if it's like in the Quran or anything, but there's a thing where men peeing standing up is disgusting. Urinals, oh my God, what the hell is that? You're supposed to sit down to pee. You're supposed to have a toilet or something like that. It's not, even if it's a hole in the ground, you're supposed to squat to pee. And men in the Western world don't do that. Hey, look at them, they need to be civilized. Now, there are kind of religions outside of this kind of monotheistic craziness, like Hindi, Buddhism, all its disparate forms. So there is spirituality that doesn't include this kind of military advantage of zealotry and creating zealots. Kind of like in a game of Civilization, you kind of build a temple, and now you get the military zealot. Now you get that person instead of just a regular soldier who may or may not fight, might try to run away, definitely going to try to avoid getting stabbed. So you kind of cut down on the cowardice. And you can even get to the point where you can have an all-volunteer army because they're going to, be part of that kind of religious zealotry kind of, or even, mix of religion and like we have in the United States, kind of these ideals of freedom and liberty, etc., individualism, which I would, I guess in my mind is a good thing, but I'm an American. I don't, have much experience being anything else. Wish I could remember my past lives. That would be great if I had any. So this kind of spirituality doesn't necessarily have to be militaristic, but it's a huge advantage to turn it into monotheistic, militaristic. Monotheistic, militaristic. I get a little ditty in my head now. So that's kind of my idea with this, that we seem to wonder why we become so warlike. Well, we have competing tribes of people and their religions. They're, monotheistic, militaristic religions. And inherent in all of those is this kind of, we should civilize the world. And there's just different levels of kind of tolerance of the other religions, whether they be monotheistic or not. And it seems to me that Islam is least tolerant. I'm not Jewish, so I don't know what's going on with Judaism. I mean, even if I was Jewish, I'd be like a Blue Lodge Jewish, like a Blue Lodge Mason. I'm sure that whatever is going on with the higher-ups, I wouldn't be privy to. So I don't know what, the Zionist plan of conquering the world. I don't know if there is one or if there's... Who knows? Because it's usually kind of a group in between, within, it's usually that smaller kind of secret leadership group that kind of does these things. And who knows if there aren't several, groups in Judaism and Christianity and Islam that are all kind of vying to become, the ones that get to conquer. Because it's going to, you're going to get people who think they need to conquer the world. That's another thing that's kind of automatic. You're going to have powerful people thinking, if I move this chess piece, and get this, and kind of like Hitler did with, kind of moving the armies around Europe to kind of conquer all of Europe, you're going to have the kind of same impetus. And of course, what was his charge? In a way, it was religious. There was definitely zealotries of Nazism. There were definitely zealots of it. People believe, keeping the race pure. Like I said, it could be ideological reasons, but it kind of goes up to a level of religion, and you get zealots. And that's kind of what you need to compete. And those that didn't, in that way, didn't win out, right? They're not powerful entities, I guess. like again, kind of loose theory, kind of figuring it out, and I love interaction with these kind of theories. What time is it? 7:30. I heard a microwave being kind of, the buttons pressed, you get those beeps. So I'm like, why the hell would anybody be up in my house? Okay. So that might kind of explain in a loose way how this period of human history with these competing greater gods or creator gods, one and only gods, and you're kind of competing with the mythologies behind it, and the rules and the ideologies that sprout. It's kind of complicated. And you kind of like, this huge, tremendous amount of sects in Christianity. I'm sure all of them think that the other ones are wrong. But there's at least a bit of, probably by accident, tolerance within Christianity of the other sects, right? None of us are really kind of going after each other and chopping each other's heads off. But most of the people dying in Muslim countries, or is it more correct to say Islamic, most of the people dying are actually other Muslims. I know Muslim is the people, Islam is the religion, but what do you call the state? I guess that's my question. So we have competing world conquerors, or people that aspire to in some way. And, those things kind of go off in different directions. Maybe they, culturally want to dominate through, a Sharia law. Maybe they just want everyone to be Jewish or Christian. It's, we don't care if you're a sect of it as long as you are. So you see these kind of different branches they could branch out into. But what it always equals is war, bloodshed. The blood gods are still thirsty. That's what comes along with the zealotry. You kind of take people's minds and you propagandize them, and they lose much of their conscious thought. Like their ego and superego are not operating correctly because there's way too much id going on. And once you have people in the id state, I guess I can call it, you have very, not easily controllable, because you could easily say the wrong thing, and they'll be like, that's not, rah. And then, some guy is like sticking a pitchfork in you because you're not the priest that they thought you were, or not the leader, whatever. And you see these kind of split-offs between religion and state, and these kind of remixings into theocracies. It's a messy, bloody, violent kind of era we've gotten into and hopefully are coming out of. And I'm not saying that atheism is the answer, and I'm always a bit turned off by the kind of like more Marxist agenda with atheism, as opposed to just, I want to believe what I want to believe. Maybe it's atheistic, maybe it isn't. I think I'm free to have my beliefs. And throughout these major religions, there are these streams of people who kind of go into it and are peace zealots, or zealots for a different kind of civility. Like, let's not chop up our enemies. And I think Christianity has the advantage of being founded kind of on that, although it obviously did do the kind of conquer the world thing as well. And there are definitely many crimes committed under Christianity, at least as it goes forward into modernity. It's not still kind of chopping the heads off of infidels. No, instead we bomb them. It's much more civilized. Those nice Christian bombs, it just kind of hug the children. I would say that, you know, in the Western world, not only is a mix of Christianities, but also kind of these kind of atheistic beliefs, because people are free to choose that. And then, so we've kind of gone to a religion of money. I don't think money's evil. It's a tool, just like any other tool, a means of exchange. But the love of money, I think that's really the evil. You don't look at the bigger picture. You only look at how much money you can make. And even in an individual company, that's when you kind of suppress wages, use all sorts of tricks to keep them from unionizing. All those kind of things happen when people don't want things to work out smoothly, like, more like Costco is run, which is actually a very successful company. And for those reasons, so you have this kind of love of money that's not necessarily successful, but it does kind of get the people what they want, right? These few people in charge or higher up, it gets them their coinage, right? And it gets it quick. That's the kind of miracle of it, right? And that's why some people tout capitalism when it's kind of, parts of it, at least that kind of super greed within it, is very destructive and could be even destructive to that company, the people that it's operating with, the culture that it's within, where its headquarters are. It's kind of a short-sighted blindness, but that's how things kind of progress. So now we're in the kind of monotheistic belief system times. And Christianity and Islam are still fighting. Even one could argue by proxy in Israel. Kind of utilizing Judaism. Well, like I said, loose theories coming out of me today. But I think that monotheism, I'm not saying it's evil, but it does become evil when it's like, hey, you're an infidel because you don't believe in my belief. You don't believe in my belief. Think about that statement. I have a belief. I believe it. Wholeheartedly believe it. And it really helps me. It helps me get through the day. It helps me raise my children. Blah, blah, blah. But, a lot of positives, moral positives. Often with that religion, people kind of descend into decadence. Although I'd say that, without spirituality, people descend into decadence, right? And monotheism could be just as spiritual, I believe. But when you have these kind of competing monotheists, it's the one that have the zealots, the one that are violent and militaristic, that will spread, because they'll literally codify it and say, you have to, conquer the infidels. So this kind of militant strain in Christianity that's been there forever, at least since Constantine, kind of explains its success. And then you have a more codified, it's not sugar-coated as much in Islam, but it's pretty much the same thing. So that's kind of my theory, and hopefully nobody wants to, find me down here in Florida and chop my head off. Because I'm really looking at how can we progress from this. How do we go from the militaristic monotheism to kind of the mix of spirituality, theism, whatever you want, but with a I'm not allowed to kill my fellow man thing. Thou shalt not murder, but you can kill. Thou shalt not conquer, unless it's jihadi, and then it's you're allowed to do that because you're defending your culture by conquering the guy next door. I don't know. And then, everybody kind of eventually becomes next door as you go along. So where do we go from here to kind of create this, a more kind of free, choose your belief, and you're free to choose it. And the separation of church and state was kind of brilliant. But at the same time, what do you do about religions that don't have that? How do you tolerate the intolerant? And this is a big question that we have when it comes to not just Islam. I'm sure there's, all sorts of sects that are kind of trying to do this at this time, of different religions. I think in India there are a couple of sects that are terroristic, that aren't Islamic. They're probably all over, right? Because, people kind of get this high off of religion. And once they're kind of told, oh, wait, we have to conquer the infidels, things go pretty bad. And it happened when Christianity was more like that not too long ago. With Christianity, we had inquisitions. And now something similar is happening with Islam. It's more of it like a straight conquering, And they have two sects of it that are warring even to this day because they disagree over who was the leader of the church after Muhammad. I think it was a son and an uncle, the argument was. So one of them is Sunni, one of them is Shia, and they've kind of differentiated themselves. I'm sure they were much more similar back during that split, probably because, hey, we're different, we got to make sure that these are the infidels. They don't do this. They don't pray 6 times a day. They pray 4 times a day. So there's these differentiations to be like, I'm more pious. And that may be kind of contributing to kind of the, because they always have each other to fight, that may contribute to them retaining this kind of militaristic ideal. I read up on Islam, and there was a certain area, there was often these kind of different Islamic churches within the area. Nobody gave them the memo that like they all had to be the same. And they would, at one point there was a part, I think in Arabia, where there was like a very scientific, very peaceful, and that was like one of the sects of Islam, but it was a sect. Right, and when we say the religion of peace, yes, some people have interpreted it as that, but it's usually kind of a certain area, and those Muslims were conquered by the other more militaristic Muslims. So going back in history and saying that, for a while this one sect was kind of advanced and actually something spiritually that people might want to aspire to, doesn't mean that sect is still around. In fact, I think when science came into it especially, I remember seeing some sort of documentary about this and also reading it up on Wikipedia, science would kind of challenge the more theocratic beliefs, and the theocrats would go and burn down the areas where they were studying medicine and where they were studying science, and that's what kind of happened with that. You have these ebbs and flows, these kind of sine waves of things. You have these different groups popping up. Humanity is very complex. We often try to simplify it, but there's a certain amount of detail you need to look at these things. I know I've made that point before, that we tend to simplify and forget that some things aren't simplifiable so easily. So, yay, maybe we've kind of figured out something here. I mean, obviously it's not, a big giant study of the world with all sorts of footnotes. It's just me kind of babbling incoherently. But it kind of makes sense to me, and that's kind of what happens. First something kind of makes sense, and you go, oh, and then you kind of go and look into it, do your research, and try to figure it out in more detail. And I'll kind of endeavor to do that. I think monotheism, or at least the monotheisms that we have, I see where that militaristic strain came from, the military advantage of it, and how that would lead to kind of an evolution of these monotheism into these kind of conquering monotheisms. And the Western world sees itself as kind of beyond that. But still, it's like an overarching Christianity in the Western world. Even if people are kind of saying they're Jedis, a lot of the Judeo-Christian beliefs are still kind of inherent in all of us in the West. Not that everyone follows them to a T. We're all sinners, but it's, we're still going to kind of have that. And what's unfortunate is that in at least the Middle Eastern Islamic world, you're going to have, for a long time, you're going to have people who are going to see taking out the infidel, beheading the infidel, etc., as perfectly acceptable. Whatever the enemies of the group may be, even if it's within themselves, and it's not even, like a gay Muslim, it's not even like somebody outside of the community or of a different church of Islam, that's going to continue. That's going to be kind of ingrained in people, and it's going to be generations before we kind of, I know people like to say modernize Islam, but I don't think that's really the point. It's kind of like to disingrain, some of these beliefs, like beating your wife, especially a lot of the beliefs with women that I just find abhorrent. I'll never be a fan of any of the cultures that do that. Any culture that does that. I don't care if they're pygmies and they don't have a religion or they have a spirit religion. That will always seem to me as crazy and mean, but I base that on being, on cruelty. You can't be cruel to people. You shouldn't be cruel to people. And I think that's kind of an overarching human belief that needs to kind of reconquer the world. And I know I sound like a hippie. In some ways I kind of am. I believe in standing up for yourself. I believe in defending yourself. I believe in gun ownership and stuff like that. But at the same time, however you defend yourself, you shouldn't be, utilizing those same tools to harm others. And maybe that's more what we as human beings should be aspiring to. Not conquering, an area with our weird mythologies. However decent the kind of moral, spiritual kind of aspects of them are, we need to kind of see what's kind of universal. And, we don't want our children to suffer. We don't want ourselves to suffer. But in a lot of ways, and I think most people don't want others to suffer. So they have to look at something as, a sin, a crime, immoral, impious, before they can kind of say, we're allowed to do X, Y, and Z. And I think criminality, those that harm others, that's a kind of good line to follow. Okay, they're harming somebody else, so therefore we can, harm them. I mean, in the simplest form, isn't that it? They've given up their rights not to be harmed because they're harming others, or another. That's a pretty good rule. We should be civilized about it, I think. Maybe others aren't so civilized, But what we shouldn't do is say, okay, it's a sin, it's immoral, blah, 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 because then where does that line go? It's just a kind of arbitrary line, and we're always going to be bickering about it. We need kind of a solid line of, are you harming somebody? No. Cool. Bit weird. Bit strange. Not my thing. I wouldn't decorate the living room that way, but I see where you're going, and I'm not going to behead you. I have no right to. And we have to kind of see it as, you don't have a right to harm another person, to abuse another person. And that's really it. That's like all religion, should really point to. Well, all our kind of rules should really point to. And in some ways, the Western kind of system does that by divorcing itself from religion. It's trying, I think. There's a lot of well-meaning people, right? Islam, it's kind of a crazy phase in some areas. Like I said, more the Middle East than the other areas where Islam is. But we'll see. As long as we insist, you can't force people to wear XYZ. The decency laws, like, women can't walk around topless in a lot of places. That's a line we have to kind of establish as far as harm to others, or maybe just a distraction. How many car crashes happen because, you drove by a bunch of topless women and, couldn't stop gawking. I'm sure there are great, brilliant legal minds that could think of a much better system, a much simpler system than what we have now. So much is based on our kind of weird morals, although we've been pulling away from that for a while to have more of a free system. But at the same time, is that kind of our thing? Is that kind of our ideology? I hope not. I dig it. So maybe we could think of hey, you have your religion, that's great. Have fun with that, but the minute you start trying to shit hammer other people for not believing what you believe, just like in crime, when you start harming others, it is time to shit hammer you. I don't mean talk, or even protests and gatherings or whatever. I mean when you try to start harming people, once you throw that fist, or grab somebody's by the belt and start throwing them over a roof, I don't think it can be argued that you're not harming another. It seems to be the more in that kind of natural human kind of way of doing things, and we may have been distracted for a while, but that doesn't mean we can't kind of revitalize just being human, and the kind of natural belief that, or at least I think, maybe I'm swayed by my being Western, but the kind of natural belief that harming others isn't cool, isn't okay. So that's kind of my tidbit for today, after kind of doing my little walk and, having a bit of a eureka moment, at least for myself. Like I said, you probably already kind of figured this out. Either way, I look forward to your interactions, and I'll talk to you next time.